today. I've got some member questions. Remember, this is technically a members live, which means that the members before today's date, I sent out an email and I'm like, hey members, do you got any questions you want me to cover? So that's one of the advantages of being a member, and I'll talk about a few of the other ones later on. But I've got some questions to answer, and then I'm going to take you through the process of making this quilt. This is a stitch and flip quilt as you go style quilt with the new kind of intersection that I used ages ago, and I hadn't used it in a long time. And the reason I kind of wanted to do it, well, two reasons. One, a friend of mine had showed it at a guild meeting that we had, a Zoom guild meeting, and I just thought it was really, really cool. And two, the Log Cabin Quilt As You Go is a very, very popular video that I have. And the hardest part about it is putting the blocks together. And this technique I really thought could work for putting the blocks together. So if you've ever tried the Log Cabin Quilt As You Go, you could consider making the blocks the way I did in the original video and then putting them together the way I'm going to show you here. But I'm going to start with a couple of questions from viewers. So, and if you have any questions while you're going, members, you can put them up. I can see all of the member questions here too, okay? So starting with Pearl. Pearl has a question that many, many, many of you have run into. Maybe you just haven't gotten around to asking me about it, but it's the idea of why don't my blocks turn out the right size? And it happens to everybody. So the first thing I'm going to tell you is that oftentimes it depends on the block. If you're doing a block like this block behind me, there's only a few seams. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's not that hard to get a block like this to actually be correct. But when it comes to a block like this, this has so many little seams around it that when there are more seams, that can mean that there's more of a chance that your block will turn out not the right size, either too big or too small. So first thing, consider the blocks that you're making. If they've got lots and lots of seams, then just know that it's quite possible that you and many other people are going to have problems getting that block to be closer to the size that it wants. I also hope that you're noticing that I've not once yet said perfect, because there isn't any perfect. I wish there was, but there's not. So we're always just trying to make it the best that we can. The second issue can be the fabrics that you're using and how you may or may not pre-treat those fabrics. Now, I talked to you a lot about using high quality fabrics and how important that is. But even high quality fabrics can have some shrinkage to it. So you can always test your fabrics. Well, three things. One, you can test the fabric. Is it going to shrink? You can test it by taking maybe a 5-inch square of that fabric, getting it wet, ironing it really, really dry, and then measure it again. Is it 4 7/8 inches? Well, that's not a big deal. That fabric's not going to shrink too much. Is it 4.5 inches? That fabric is going to shrink quite a bit. So knowing what the fabric is going to do. So there's a couple things that you can do about that. One, you can pre-wash your fabric. I'm not usually prone to do that. If you are, should take care of. If you pre-wash and pre-shrink your fabrics, then you will probably get rid of any shrinkage that may happen. What I'm more likely to do is to pre-treat it with some sort of spray sizing. So I'll take like my Mary Ellen's Best Press. Well, let's turn it this way. There, Mary Ellen's Best Press. I'm seeing all these people coming in. Hello, everybody. And I'm seeing a lot of members. And Pamela, you're from Olive Branch, Mississippi. My brother lives in Olive Branch, Mississippi. Small, small world we live in. So Best Press. So by doing it with Best Press, that is going to get it to shrink. But you need to remember to do it before you go and sew the pieces together, cut the pieces. So lately, if you watched the very first episode of Sunset Over Dublin, I took that fabric and I dunked it. Oh my goodness, Brazil, hi. I took the fabric, I dunked it in Mary Ellen's, I squeezed it out, and then I pressed it, and it was great to work with because it was really, really stiff. And with the Sunset Over Dublin quilt, there's all these triangles and half square triangles and all these things. And it just made the process of making that quilt much, much funner. So that's something I probably will do a lot more in the future. So pre-shrinking, or either by washing it or by dunking it or spraying it with your spray sizing, that will help. But you must do it before you cut out the pieces. So take that half a yard that you're going to use and spray size it or dunk it or wash or whatever you're going to do. But do that first. Another thing that you can consider is the thread that you're using. If you're not using a 50 weight thread, then your thread may be too thick, making your seams thicker. And so when the fabric folds over the thread, it actually makes the block smaller. And it's not a lot. It's only a little bit, but every little bit counts. The last thing is a test that I teach my beginners in the very, very beginning of my learning to quilt. And it's the idea of finding your scant 1/4 inch. So the idea is you take 3 strips of fabric. So in the learning to quilt class, one of the first things we do is a 9-patch block. So, this works for that. Or the rail fence, that idea. But take 3 strips of fabric and cut those strips of fabric. Cut. That's not a big enough marker. Let me get a bigger marker. There. Cut 1.5 inches wide. 3 pieces. All right. Then sew those 3 pieces together. And when you press it out, the center piece should measure 1 inch. If your scant 1/4 inch is correct. If your scant 1/4 inch isn't correct, then you've got to correct that in order to make that 1 inch. Now, there's a lot of different things that you can do for making your scant 1/4 inch. Some people like to try the, the feet with the metal guards on the side. I'm not a huge fan of that one. Oops, I got my caught. So what I like to do are a couple of things that you'll see me do a lot in the Sunset Over Dublin. This one I've been doing since the beginning of time. This is the seam guides. This is Guidelines for Quilting. See their little logo up there? Guidelines for Quilting Seam Guides. And you see how even in the picture, they have that seam guide set there either in front of or to the side of your presser foot. Now, on my machine, and most modern machines, it's not like you got to have like a $5,000 machine to have a machine that does this. Most modern machines, you can move the needle over so that if you put the seam guide right next to your foot and just move the needle over so that from the edge of your foot to the needle, try and find that scant 1/4 inch. And remember, it's never a 1/4 inch. It's always a scant 1/4 inch, which is like 1 thread or so short of a 1/4 inch. Something else I've been using a lot lately, and I use this a lot in the Sunset Over Dublin, is the diagonal tape from, see that little chicken? That's the cluck cluck sew people, all right? This tape, which is kind of like washi tape, if you're into paper crafting at all, it's sticky, but not super sticky. And there's a ton of it on this roll. You line it up. See that red line? Line the red line up with your needle. So if you have a machine whose needle cannot go left to right, this is an option. Line that red line up with your needle. Then the inside, you can see where it says 1/4 inch. If you're past the black line, it'll be too big. But if you guide your fabric inside, right on the inside of that black line, that helps with your 1/4 inch too. So there's just a lot of things that you got to try. But I got to tell you, it's never going to be perfect. And you're only trying to get it as close as possible. All right. Now, one other thing to keep in mind, kind of as a last resort, and in my blocks, I'm all the time, making the block, trimming the block, making the block, trimming the block. Always do that. But here's another thought. Try improvisational piecing. If you do improvisational piecing, it doesn't matter what seam allowance you have. This technique that we're going to use back here, doesn't matter what seam allowance you have. So there are other options out there. One of the, for improvisational piecing, maybe try to find a book called Liberated Quilt Making by Gwen Marston. Now, she was a superstar in quilting, passed away just a little while ago. She lived in Michigan, up in one of our, so if this is Michigan, she lived up in one of the islands that are over here that, like, I don't know, it's not for me. I kind of like the city a little bit, but that's a really cool book. And with that book, doesn't matter what size your seams are, you are a liberated quilt maker if you're following Gwen Marston's rules. Okay, so that covers it for Pearl's question. Now, Angie's question is a little bit harder to handle, and she says that you watched all of my videos on doing borders, but she says that when she's putting on multiple borders, that her borders start getting waffly on the edges. You've got to remember that you must measure the quilt 3 times every time you're putting on a border. So when you go to put on, like, let's say a border like this, I am going to measure from this edge. Now, I'm never going to measure at the very edge of the quilt. I'm always going to measure in maybe 3/4 of a block or a block here. So I'm going to measure from here across. Then I'm going to come to the center of the quilt from here across. Then about the same distance at the bottom of the quilt, 3 times. Every time I'm going to measure it, and then I'm going to cut the border that size. So if this figures out to 56 3/8 inches, I am going to cut the border strip 56 3/8 inches. I'm not going to leave a little extra just in case. We don't want no just in cases here. You want to pin that border that is cut to that length, matching the 2 ends, matching the center, and I've put in, I don't know, pins about that far apart, all the way across it. I'm going to pin it like crazy. So after I have my side borders on, then I'm going to measure. So I first measure the length, then I measure the sides. I'm going to measure that, put on my top borders, and then I'm going to measure again for my second border. And then I'm going to always pre-cut it to whatever size the quilt says it is. You never just take a strip and sew the quilt on until the quilt is done and then cut off the excess strip. Not the way to do it. My battery on my... Okay, it says it's on battery. I don't know why. Hopefully it's charging now. Okay, it's plugged in. Sorry. So, Ange, you need to measure, pin. Go back to those border videos. Hopefully that will help. Now, somebody else had a question about sashings. Well, how do you match up sashings like this when there is no cornerstone in the center? It's not easy, especially if your sashing is very wide. Now, we are going to do it with this quilt, but these sashings are only 1 inch. So when it's only 1 inch, not so hard to match it up. My suggestion is if you're doing sashings that are more than 1 inch, put a cornerstone in. There's no reason not to put a cornerstone in. It always is going to bump up the interest of your quilt because you can add more fabric, and that can't be a bad thing, right? So once you've put the cornerstones in, then you're able to match up the seams from one row to the next row. But what if you don't want that extra color? You don't want that extra burst of fabric there. You could make it the same color as the sashing. That's an option. So that would be my recommendation, but really my first recommendation is put in some cornerstones. I love cornerstones in a quilt. I think they look cool. All right. Now the next question, again, I can't remember who this one is from. Hi, Karen. It's you guys are talking about weather. Yeah, we've had a little bit of some snow here in Michigan, and it's, I don't know, about, 8 inches or something, nothing like Minnesota or those guys got. But we're also not up in the UP of Michigan to get a lot more. So we got some snow. And so with my leaving my real job and just doing this for a living, and instead I decided that I didn't want to pay a plow guy. I just decided that I needed to be more frugal with my money because this is what I was going to do. I wasn't going to be a salesperson anymore. And so I've had to do some shoveling. It's really hard work. I don't know how much longer I can put up with that, but I'm doing my very, very best. Okay. The next question, can't remember who asked me the question, was on putting together the block by block Quilt As You Go. So after I did the whole series on the quilted tiles, remember those blocks were like 18 inches and they were really quite large. I showed you how to do the block by block method, and that was a book from Beth Donaldson called Block by Block. No longer in print. You might be able to find it on Etsy, but after I did that series, I know a lot of people went on Etsy and found it. So maybe call your best quilting friends, see if any of them have that book because it's not in print anymore. So what she was having trouble with was the sashings. So this is where and I watched my video and I don't think I clarified this well enough. So I'm going to do it right now. So here are 2 blocks from a block by block quilt. FYI, these are blocks that I made with some of the painted fabric that I've been painting. I've been a little bit going crazy painting fabric again. Now, I have not fully quilted these yet. I want you to keep that in mind. I will fully quilt this before I would do any of that, but I have enough quilted that I can show you what I'm going to do. So when you get done with the quilting, so there's some paper under there, so ignore that paper under there. When you get done with all of the quilting, you are going to trim the block. So this block, where there is quilting and there's no sashing, you are going to trim that block right to the edge. Okay? The block next to it, the sashing and the cornerstone are not quilted at all, even all the way up to the seam. You cannot even do any stabilizing quilting there. You need to have that whole thing be free. When you're putting the blocks together, you take this block and you put it over on top of the quilted. So there's that quilted edge. I'm going to take this block, I'm going to match up the sashings and pin, 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 pin. All right. So where the block has been quilted, it is going to be connected to the sashing, and I would pin, 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 pin. But where it is the cornerstone, you are not going to sew through the batting. You need to keep this separate. So for this, right there where the cornerstone is, you sew just through the sashing from below and the cornerstone. So I'm going to put in an imaginary seam here. How many of you guys have actually tried the block by block? Let me know. See if anybody else was having troubles with this. So when you do it that way, I'm going to put in some pretend seam, another pretend seam. All right. When you get that sewed, so this one all the way through the quilt and just the sashing, here by the cornerstone, just the unquilted sashing and the unquilted cornerstone. When you flip that over, this down here will be able to completely peel up like this. And with this completely peeled up, you can then attach the next row to this. So she wrote me just saying that she could not figure out how to get the next row attached because I think that she sewed this down. So remember that the sashing and cornerstone at the bottom, you're only sewing through the sashing and cornerstone. All right. So nobody has actually tried this. Give me a comment if you've actually tried the Quilt As You Go. Let me know how it worked. I'm hoping everybody had a good time with it. All right, so then the next question came from Susan. All right, I wrote down a name. All right, so Susan was wondering about how to stiffen her fabrics. And so we were talking about that a little bit earlier. There are some options. So before Bill's coming downstairs, that means something's wrong?
An audio thing.
Oh, an audio thing.
Switch back to overhead cam.
Switch back to my overhead cam. Or are we getting
2 mics?
Audio.
I think it's that one.
All right, so if I talk. Okay, I'm just going to pause here for a minute. Can you hear me? So comment if you can hear me. Can you hear me? Can you elaborate on completing the back of it when you do a quilt by the... Mary, you're going to want to actually follow through with the block by block because I do cover all of that. Hey, Vicki, can you hear? Okay, if I go back to the overhead, can you hear me? Can't hear you. All right, I'm back to the overhead. Okay, so maybe you guys can hear me now. We're switching. Okay, so I'm going to stay right here again. All right, Ange, no sound. Antria. You sent me how to say your name. I hope I'm saying that right. All right, I'm waiting. I'm waiting. Okay, now I'm on the laptop again. Can you hear me on the laptop? All right, I'm going to hang out. Stay on the overhead. Well, that would be a fine idea, but there are some other things I have to show you. All right. Yes, on the overhead, but how about on the front? Can hear you on the overhead camera. Okay, so now I'm on the front. Can you hear me on the front? I'm waiting. I guess I need to untria, like truck without the K. Not now, though. Yes, yes. All right, I'm going to proceed. You guys can hear me. Okay. Susan asked about stiffening fabric. I used to use Niagara sizing that's in a can, an aerosol can. It was a sizing, not a starch. Starch is made of sugar. If you spray that on a quilt, and maybe you don't finish that quilt right away, maybe it's an unfinished project that's in a box here in your basement here in Michigan where we've got basements. What if something comes to eat the sugar on the quilt, on the fabric that I sprayed? What if that thing that comes to eat it has lots of legs? Well, that means Nancy's going to open the box and never finish that quilt. I'm going to throw the whole thing away. So to prevent that from ever possibly maybe happening, I just use sizing. Sizing isn't sugar. So I used to use that for a long time. But there were issues with it. It used to leave residue on the fabric. My iron would stick to it. I had to do a little jiggy to keep it from sticking to it. Well, then Mary Ellen's Best Press came out. Love it. I honestly I still think it might be a little pricier. I think it's expensive. It just is expensive. But I don't know what it takes to process it. They did the R&D. They should be making some money too. So I am willing to pay for the Mary Ellen's Best Press. Keep in mind, I usually get the big gallon size because I can get it at the store and then they don't charge me shipping. So this is the option. In the beginning of the Sunset over Dublin, when I do the dunking technique, I tried the vodka technique. So people have been telling me, Nancy, you need to try the vodka. It works great. And I did it right on camera. And if you watch the very first episode of Sunset over Dublin, you will see very quickly that I did not care for it. It made it slightly stiffer, not enough for me. So here is some other options. Material Magic. There it is. It is a fabric stabilizer. Now, with this and with a new one, this is from ThermoWeb. This is Spray Fabric Stiffener. With both of these, you can see it right there on the bottom. It says, makes fabric more paper-like. It does, but it's too stiff. It's almost not paper-like, it's cardboard-like. And cardboard is just too stiff. So I use this for some techniques, but not for my normal pressing of my seams, making things stiffer. But if you want it to be super stiff, here's two products to give a try. I think Material Magic is a little bit more affordable. This one is brand new. I've only used it a little bit, so you'd have to let me know how it works. All right? So there you go. Those are the questions that were asked, and there are the answers. So now we're getting ready. So I'm going to look and see, is there any other questions? Yes, stay right there. All right, no questions coming around. Let me back up a smidge. There's been a lot of comments because of all the sound issues. I just hope that you guys understand how hard Bill and I try to do this technology thing. So, okay. All right, so now I'm going to talk to you about the quilt behind me and making this quilt. So I did make a pattern of it. So earlier I mentioned that I was able to take questions from the members, any members, basic members, all the way up to Quilt Addict members. And there is a link below that you can click on to find out all of the perks about it. Well, the pattern will be on my website for $9.99, probably tomorrow when I get time to breathe after getting all set up for this. But the Quilt Addicts will be getting this in their email, so they don't have to pay for any new patterns that I do. Any new patterns I do, Quilt Addicts immediately get that pattern. And once a month, I'm kind of backlogging and stuff, so they get another pattern that I've done once a month. You don't get them all at once. That would be a little bit of an overkill. But just keep that in mind. That's one of the perks, the Quilt Addict perk. So here is the pattern, and I'm going to take you through step by step how this works. All right. So the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to take some batting, and I'm going to, generally speaking, use a cotton or a cotton blend. Not very often, if ever. Yeah, okay, never. Am I going to do a quilt as you go with a polyester? I just barely handle polyester, and I don't do anything with polyester batting, honestly. So this is the batting, and I'm going to take that batting, and I've cut it 16 inches. Keep in mind that these blocks finish 14 and a half, so I'm cutting it an inch and a 2 inches larger than the finished size. Where'd my big marker go? There it is. All right. I want you to take the batting, and with the batting, line up your ruler. And so I don't know if you can see because it's way down here and I can't zoom in the camera because it's way too high. The point of the batting, I'm going to have to move this stuff off here so you can see it better. Okay, hopefully I'll be able to keep everything in order. Hopefully everything doesn't fall when I put it over there. All right, this you're going to be able to see better. Thank you very much, Vicki. All right, so I'm going to take the batting and I'm going to line up the ruler so that the 1/4 inch mark of the ruler is on the corner of the batting. So this would be right on the corner. I'm going to line it up so that it is 1/4 of an inch past that. And then I'm going to take a marker. So this is a Stedler Pigma liner. It is a 1.0, so it's got a bigger tip as opposed to, and not that these don't, this comes in the size, I just don't have it, but this is a teeny tiny one that won't work. So this one's a 1.0, which seems to be the perfect size. All right. I'm going to take and draw a line on my batting. All right. Now I'm going to flip the batting over and do that on the back side too. Because what's so cool about this quilt as you go technique, you're making a reversible quilt. So there is, I should have showed you that ahead of time. So this is the front side. At the same time, I'm making this. So it's 2 colors as you go. So you have to mark both sides of the batting. All right. So I've got my line drawn on my batting. Now it's time for the placement. And this is the most complicated. Everything else on this quilt block just goes one right after another. But this is a little bit complicated. The line that you drew, you want to be sure that that line is on the same side of the square. So the line was drawn to the right-hand side, and if I flip it over, it's on the same side. That is very, very important, okay? Now I'm going to take the fabrics that I cut. Now these fabrics, this one was cut, it's a 16-inch square also, but all that is in the instructions. So, and this block could be done with any size, any style too. I really would like the idea of like doing a wonky rail fence with it, right? So this piece is right side up, and I am lining it up with the edge, that line that I just drew. Now I'm going to take the first strip in the design and lay it down right on that edge, right side down. I'm going to put a few pins in here so that this does not move around when I go to the next step. Now I'm going to flip it over. And so you can see that here is the pieces that I just did on the side closest to me. Now, this is the confusing one. This time, you're going to take the number 1 strip, lay it down on the straight line that I drew, right side's up. So there's the wrong side. That's a down, so right side up. And then the large triangle in this case is going to be right side down. Okay. So now I'm going to take that and pin that. And when I'm pinning this one, I'm not going to pin it just a little bit. I'm going to pin this every couple of inches. So I got to let you know, I only started working on this yesterday, and I got, well, 12 of the blocks completely done. And it figured out with all of the cutting and everything, once I got everything cut, I could get 2 blocks done in an hour. And I thought that was pretty good time. I thought that, you could get a quilt made pretty quickly with this technique once you get the little processes done. All right. So there we have it. It's all pinned. Now I'm going to go sew. and I'm going to switch cameras to this camera over here. So, hi, I'm right here. All right. I'm going to take and sew this. Now, I have some blue tape on my machine, and I cannot get the camera any closer. Otherwise, I can't actually sew. So, hopefully, you're okay with that. I do have my leader on. I've got the blue tape there. That does not come into play yet. Don't pay attention to the blue tape. You can't anyhow because you wouldn't be able to see it. But what I'm going to do when I am sewing this seam, I am not using a scant 1/4 inch. I am using my regular foot with the needle in the middle. Oftentimes with Quilt As You Go, everything is so bulky that a 1/4 inch seam just can be not big enough. So I've decided just to use the edge of my foot. Now, by using the edge of my foot, I thought some people are going to go, yeah, but how big is your foot? This foot is a 3/8 of an inch from the edge of the foot to the needle, 3/8 of an inch. If you have a thinner foot, it'll still work. You could still use a 1/4 inch foot if you wanted to. You could even use it if it's slightly bigger, but not much bigger than 3/8 of an inch. I also want you to see what's happening as I am taking out my pins. And I know it's a little bright by the machine, but it just is what it is. As I'm taking out the pins, I am using that pin to help draw the top fabric up. Okay, and then poking it into my pin cushion. By doing that, I'm keeping the fabric from walking forward. Now, I have a faff that does have the IDT walking foot, but even with that, especially on this seam, because it's a bias, it wanted to walk forward. So by just taking the pin out before I came to it, I was able to kind of hold that down as I went. And it worked out really, really nicely. All right. Then I'm going to go off onto a leader and find my scissors and take that off. Now I'm going to step over here. Now you're not going to really be able to see very much, but I'm going to step over here to the iron. Okay. Whoop, iron turned off, but that's okay. Let me see what you can see. Yep, you can see. So I'm going to now press it. So this guy, I'm going to press it, and I always want to set my seam just like with everything else that I do, right? Going to set the seam, and I'm going to flip this up. After I have flipped it up and pressed it in place, then I'm going to take my 505 basting spray. See my 505 basting spray? I'm going to lift the fabric back up and spray on the batting a triangle. So now this triangle will stay in place because this is going to be the back of the next block. Then I'm going to flip this over. This time I just have to flip up the green. Now I am not going to spray size the first strip, just going to press that. But the large triangle here, I'm going to spray, not spray size, spray based. I'm going to spray base this so that it won't move around when I'm doing all of the next steps. Okay, all right, going back. All right, so I have this one pressed over and this guy going the other way. So you can see how I've got two colorways going. The next step is very, very important because I find that if I don't do it, my blocks just don't turn out, the strips don't all turn out quite as nice as I'd like them to be. So this is the idea. All right. So I'm going to do it with this one. So I've already added one, but I'll do another one here for you. And it is the idea of marking your next placement line. So I'm going to take my ruler and I'm lining it up at 1.5 inches. And you can, if you see really closely, you can see how over here I've got hardly no seam. Over here I've got quite a bit of a seam. It just seems to me that there's no way to get it to run perfectly straight because there is no perfect in quilting. So I'm going to take a pencil. In this case, I'm using the Boheen white pencil, and these are the ones with the 9mm leads. These, every tool I'm talking about here, you can pick up at firesidequilts.com. That's owned by my friend Laura, who she actually just bought a house, her grandmother's house, which I think is so cute. So we're going to have a warehouse sale soon, so keep in touch. All right, and then I'm flipping it over. And now on this one, because the fabric is lighter, Going to line it up at 1.5, and with this, you can actually even see, look at right there in the middle. I got a bow in it. I don't know how I got a bow in it. I just know that it's there. So by drawing the lines, I won't continually accentuate that bow. The next strip will be straighter, hopefully. But, you know, there's always, anything can happen, right? So now I'm going to take the next color, which got to come over here to get, I think are these two. Okay. So the next color on this one, let me see, is that right? Yep, is this. So now I'm going to take this piece, I'm going to line it up with the drawn line, not with the edge of the piece below it, with the drawn line, and then I will sew with that same 3/8 inch seam allowance. I'll put not quite as many pins, because with this piece I'm only sewing through a fabric, batting, and then these two fabrics on top. And before I go to the machine to sew this one, I'm going to also place the other side. Ooh, I didn't get the right color for that. Should be this one. All right. So it's a lighter one. All right. So there's my white line. I'm going to line that up on this side. So when I do go to the sewing machine, I'm able to sew this side, flip it over, and sew the other side. And I found it most efficient to work on 2 blocks at a time. So sort of chain piecing 2 blocks at a time. That seemed to be the most efficient way to do it. After you get your block completely made, it should look something like this. So I've just added. In the pattern, I tell you to cut these strips 2 inches, and then there's different lengths to make them long enough here. And then the final triangle, I cut 7 inches. So this was 16, 7, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. All right. And then on both sides. So there's my 2 colorways. Now the thread that I used is kind of important. I did not want the thread to be really noticeable on the back side. And since this is technically not really piecing, you're doing quilting. And if you've ever watched any of my quilting videos, you'll know that I say it's okay to quilt with polyester thread. If you've got poly in the top, poly in the bobbin. And the thread that I like to use in my bobbin is the bottom line, because I mean, how close do I got to get to see whether or not you guys can actually see that? If I get any closer, it just gets blurry. So I chose for my thread, because I knew it would hide here and it would hide here, I chose to use kind of a creamy gold tan-ish color of bottom line. So bottom line is from Superior Threads. And you know, which reminds me, if you ever go to Superior Threads website, so I don't know, it might be superiorthreads.com, I'm not really sure. They have the most exceptional thread education. They've got really, really great threads too, but there is lots of other great threads. But nobody else is willing to tell you all about the threads, how they're manufactured, what does that number mean? What does this term mean? If you ever want to become a threadologist, okay, maybe that's a word, I don't know. Go to Superior's website, look up their thread education, exceptional thread education. So for this, the piecing and quilting, piecing/quilting of this block, I used the bottom line by Superior, and it worked great because it really was very hidey on all of the colors. You really can't see the colors. Also, on the large triangles, because this is such a large spot, you do want to do some additional quilting here. So you could do more lines until you get to the end. I just didn't want to. So instead, you could do more quilting. I actually thought, I don't have anything to draw it with. Yeah, I do. I actually thought that I would free motion quilt something, so I'm going to use my friction pen here. I thought that I would come in, and I should be doing it as I'm making the blocks, but I was running out of time, so I didn't. So my thinking was that I would do something like this of the quilting in each one of the blocks. Can you see that? Yeah, kind of little fleur-de-lis. I thought that looked kind of cool. But you would want to do that, at least you want to mark what you're trimming, or at least trim it first. The needle that I'm using, Peggy, is a Microtex Sharp 80. On that Superior website, they also have thread or needle information. What thread for what needle? For this step, I wanted a very, very sharp, pointy needle. That is a Microtex. For normal piecing, when I'm just doing 2 layers of cotton, I use a 70 Microtex, very, very sharp needle. For this, because I was going to be going through all these layers, I wanted the sharpness, but then I didn't want it to be so big. Like for my quilting, I usually use a 90 top stitch. That's a bigger needle. For this, a Microtex 80, perfect needle. Didn't have any problems at all with that. Okay, so after you have the block made, it is time to trim it. So this is when you want to pull out your big ruler. So this happens to be well, of course it's an Omni Grid because that's all I use. It is an Omni Grid 16.5-inch, which is just like bonus. And I got to move this, try to move this. There, okay, I got the glare. Okay. So on the ruler, I have used some of the Omni Grid glow tape here on the edge to tell me this is the 14.5 inches. I also drew another diagonal here. Now on the ruler itself, you can see that there's the diagonal that all square rulers are going to have. Well, I wanted there to be also a diagonal this way, so I could kind of just make sure that I had everything lined up really nicely. Then because it is such a big block and I'm cutting, and rulers just can have a tendency to slide around. I got something new I want to show you. There it is. All right. It's called Grip Not Slip. Right. What's really cool about this, first of all, it works. That's also very cool. But the gal that makes this is right here in West Michigan. I actually met her in a class that I was doing. She has been, it's called Quilt Queen is the name of her company. They've been selling these at the shop that I teach at, which is Smith Owen Sewing Center. But she was in a class of mine, and I'm like, I've tried them. They're pretty cool. So the website is quilt-queen.com. Now, I do know that Laura at Fireside Quilts has these. There are 4 pieces in each one. What this is, we don't have feel-o-vision, so you're not going to be able to feel it, but it is a clear, kind of, sort of sandpaper that sticks down onto your ruler. Now, it does come up. So I was able to, I took some pointy scissors and I got that under there, and I was able to peel that up so when you don't want it, you can get rid of it. It's not stuck there for life. For this, I just put some pieces here, here, and here, just to keep it from moving because I'm cutting such a large square. This also leads me to the idea of keeping yourself strong enough to quilt. I mentioned it one time not that long ago that I work out just about every morning. Go to Planet Fitness, and I do that so I'm strong. I want to stay strong with quilting. And when it comes to squaring up a block like this, not only do you not want the ruler to shift around on you, but you also want to be strong enough to cut through all the layers. So be sure that you have a nice, sharp, new blade. That would be a number 1. And then we're going to trim. Now, when you're trimming, I'm pushing down with all of my might, and that is my arm. Did I get that right? Nope, I've got to move it over. I didn't get quite enough on there. I didn't analyze my block correctly. So because it's my arm that's doing so much of that work, and then, of course, when I get up here to the top, pressing down, keep working out. Don't think that working out is for jocks. Working out is for quilters. We need to stay strong. I know, off on a tangent I am, but I do think it's important that you stay strong so that you're able to keep enjoying life. And then for me, enjoying life means quilting. So now I've turned that. Now I'm going to line this up to the 14 using my glow tape to help remind me where the 14.5 is. Looking at my diagonal, I've got my little grippers in there holding it, and then cut and cut. And also, I do have a very high table, so for ease of cutting, you can also use a lower table. So the idea of actually working on your dining room table when it comes to squaring things up, because then it's lower and you can use your body weight to help keep it strong. Okay, so my block is now squared, and now it's time for the sashings. So here is the deal with the sashings, the dealio with the sashings. One sashing, you are going to just cut the 2 inches and keep it flat. You don't need to do any scoring on it, any pressing or anything. I tried a lot of different techniques and I found this just worked out best. All right. The other sashing for the other colorway, so I've got the black for the orange colorway and then the cream for the purple colorway. On that one, you want to fold over one edge by 1/2 of an inch. So the way that I do that is I first fold the piece in half and press a crease right in the middle. Then when I'm taking this edge and fold it right up to that crease, I know that that is 1/2 inch. You need to have that done so that when it's time for it to all go together, you'll have a finished seam. Also, cut the sashings, just like hello Malaysia, greetings from Malaysia. What kind of quilting do you do in Malaysia? Because I think of Malaysia as being warm, and so why would you need quilts? But obviously, maybe there aren't quilts, so that makes perfect sense. Okay, back to the sashings. Cut the sashings the size you need. So this block is 14.5 inches. I cut my sashings 14.5 inches. I don't just take one big long piece and sew it, and then when it's at the end, cut it off. That is a surefire way to get your quilt to not be the right size. You want to cut the sashings whatever size. And I say whatever size because they're not always going to be 14.5. When you are, if we look at just the center block, this sashing was cut 14.5. Then this sashing was cut 14.5 so that these 2 blocks and these 2 blocks could go together. But when it came time for the 2 blocks to go together, this sashing needed to be cut 20.5 inches because it was just one piece. Then I went back to 14.5 and 20.5, and that's all explained in the pattern. But just kind of keep that in mind. All right. So now we're going to go to the sewing machine, but I want to tell you that my seam allowance is now changing. I need a 1/2 inch seam allowance for this because I've got the 2-inch wide strip and I need it to come out to as close to perfect as 1 inch when I'm finished. Okay. So I'm going to go to my sewing machine and I have put a piece of tape on my sewing machine and my machine, and probably your machine has it too, there's a little bit notch here next to the foot that says it's a 1/2 inch. So I just put some of the blue painter's tape. I just put a line of the blue painter's tape so that from my needle to the blue edge of the blue tape is a 1/2 inch. Oops, sorry, I just jiggled you. All right. So now I'm going to sew this, let's get in there, with a 1/2 inch. And I'm going to do that same idea. As I take my pin out, I'm going to help keep that pin. That pin is going to help me keep everything in line. Okay. Doing my best to keep that as close to that 1/2 inch as possible. You know, I know that this is not the best camera angle, and I thought about just showing you it. Oh, I've already sewed it. But I know that a lot of people actually like to see the process done instead of just talked about it. So that is why I chose to do it this way. Even though it's not the best camera angle, at least you have a camera angle. All right, cut off my leader, cut off this side. Okay, now going back to the overhead. So I've got that sewn with a 1/2 inch on either side. I'm going to cut off that thread. All right. Now I'm ready to attach my second piece. So my second piece, yep, that's how it's going to go. It's going to be like this. Okay. So I'm going to take that strip. I do not need to press it yet, but I'm going to take this now and flip it over. And then I'm going to pin the living daylights out of this sashing going on here. Right? And on this time, I'm only going to be sewing through the straight sashing, the black sashing in this particular quilt. I'm not even going to be sewing through the cream sashing with the fold. That one is just going to hang out, but I am going to put lots of pins in. You ever want to prove that you're a patient person, you will do lots of pinning just like I do because it takes patience. Working on a quilt as you go with the first block swap. Very interesting. I don't know what that means, Jim. Working on a quilt as you go with the first block swap. You might need to send me an email so I'll know what that is. Now I'm going to go and sew this seam right here with that 1/2 inch seam allowance again. Okay. There we go. And I know people, I do oftentimes, you've seen me do it, people commented on all the time that I sew over pins. I do oftentimes sew over pins, but not when it's so thick. I started sewing over pins because I'm, just lazy that way, and I broke a couple pins. So for this technique, and I think it's because the pins are actually raised up off the surface because it is, quilt as you go and it's kind of thick, that I kind of kept running into my pins. So I decided that the best option, because I don't want my machine to need a timing, is to actually take the pins out as I go. All right, got a long thread on there. Okay, cut off my leader. Now I'm going to go to my ironing board, but before I go to my ironing board, I want you to see what's happened. Okay, so I sewed this one. Now, because I've done the 1/2 inch, do you see how these are butting together? They're just knock kissing each other right there in the middle. I'm going to go and press that. But before I press that, I want to have handy my seam tape. So the seam tape, so this is the heat press batting together. This is what we use when we have scraps of batting, so just pieces, scraps of batting, and like you really don't want to have to go buy more batting, so you can use this seam tape to put these two together. Now, lots of people use zigzags. I know lots of people like to use different things. The pin cushion on my wrist, Debbie, that is my fabulous pin cushion. There's patterns and kits available on our website. So this is the heat press. Comes on a rather large roll. I actually buy the 100-yard roll too. And it puts the two battings together. For all intents and purposes, this is a tricot, fusible tricot interfacing. Tricot meaning it has a little bit of stretch to it and it won't tear like a non-woven fusible interfacing will. And that's all this is. It's fabulous. I love it. And what you want to do is you want to purchase the 3/4 inch. I didn't have any 3/4 inch. All I had handy was a 1.5. Now there is a 3/4 inch available. I got a rotary cutter somewhere. So because I only had the 1.5 inch and the 2 inch, and I did, Marty Michelle has a 1 inch, but 1 inch is too thick. So I didn't want to use that one with this one. So instead, because I didn't have time to get the 3/4 inch from yesterday, when the time that I decided I was going to do this project. So what I was doing was just taking it, folding it in half, and cutting it into half so that I had my 3/4 inch. There you go. Desperate times call for desperate measures. Now I'm going to take this. There we go. And I'm going to put this over top of that seam. I'm going to go to the ironing board. I'm going to press this flat first, then I'm going to put this over top of the seam. And that is going to help hold the batting, that seam, together for a long time. So first, I kind of give it a little tug as I'm pressing those together. I'd give it some steam if I had any, but it looks like I'm all out of steam. Okay. Then I'm going to take this with the bumpy side down, and I'm going to lay it over top of that seam. Press it. Oh, there's the steam. It's back. Over top of that seam. And then while I'm here, I'm going to take and I'm going to kind of pre-press this, and then I'll show you what I'm actually going to do with this. Giving it some steam, steamy steam, steam. There. All right. Okay, back here. So that is now pressed in place. So you can see the two seams, and then this is the tricot interfacing going over the top of it. Right? So they've butt together right there. So no extra fabric, no extra layers. A tiny bit of extra layers when you're intersecting rows, but not in the blocks. And then this one already has that 1/2 inch folded over. So now I'm going to take some of the Roxanne's glue base that I use for everything, and I'm going to put dots of the Roxanne's glue here. And then put that to the other side. There. And because I'm impatient, instead of just letting it dry naturally, I'm going to go back to my ironing board. I'm going to press that dry, and then I'm going to sew it. And I'm going to sew it down with the same thread that I've been piecing with so far, which is that bottom line. And when I'm sewing it, I'm going to be sewing it on the ledge. So if you've ever seen any of my quilting videos, I always talk about, and I'll try to get a close-up that I can possibly get when I get this done. I talk about my first quilting of the borders always being on the ledge. I'm not a fan of in the ditch, rarely do any in the ditch quilting, but I like on the ledge, which means instead of quilting right here off the edge of the seam, instead I am up. I'm up on about 1/8 of an inch. Now keep in mind something else I ran into while I was working on this. Even though I have a big machine, this is my little machine, kind of in the, let me see, I'm going to turn it a little bit. There's my FAF icon back there. So I do have a bigger machine. It just won't fit over here on the table. Okay, let me see if I can get that line back up again. Hey, that was pretty slick. Oh, no, it's not. Can I get it back lined up again? Okay, so I've only got one more line seam to sew. So even though I was working with these on my FAF icon, I kind of ran out of space here. When you're working on a bigger quilt, when it's time, even though this is Quilt As You Go, you are going to have some crunchy space here. So somebody had written me saying that she was going to be making a king size Quilt As You Go log cabin, which is, I'm so glad that she's trying the technique, that she's working with it. But just because it's Quilt As You Go does not mean that there isn't going to be some bulky parts for you to play with. So kind of keep that in mind, because I found that when I got to the part where I had to put 3 rows in here, it was a little bit of a tight squeeze. All right. So I've sewed down, I first sewed down not the glued side. I first sewed down the side that was sewn down, and second, I sewed down the glued side. So got a notification coming up. I hate that. There. Okay. So let's see if you can see it. Can you see the line? So that's my on the ledge, and it is on both sides right there. Okay? And that put my rows together. So I'm sorry, my blocks together. And then it would be the actual putting them together into the rows when you're done. So there you go. That is an easy sashing technique for Quilt As You Go. But I do want to show you something else. I want to show you this design on Electric Quilt. So Electric Quilt is the program that I use for designing quilts. Okay, so this quilt, this is how I designed it. Now the yardage and stuff didn't work out as this is because it is Quilt As You Go, but it really helped me with my design and the placements. So for instance, that was another design. So this was the back side, and then this is the front side. So when you're doing a quilt like this, an electric quilt, I think this is one of the coolest features. It's this serendipity button. With the serendipity button, I can just click on the serendipity. Yep, I am on it. Now when I click on the block, it is going to change the entire quilt. So I can choose what type of design I want to make. And especially with a quilt like this, I took and I played with a lot more blocks. So let's go over here. These are some of the ones that I saved that I thought were cool designs. I like that one. I really thought this kind of was more of a modern design, I guess. And then I got to this one, because this quilt can be done in what is called the barn raising technique. This is traditionally done with log cabin quilts, but it can also be done with a quilt like this. So if you were to make one really big, and then I could do the serendipity even, ooh, like how cool is that? I didn't even see that one. There's another one of the turned around the other way. So that's the serendipity button. So when you're designing on electric quilt, this is just one of the ways. It's a lot easier to play with it this way than to sit and actually play with these, figuring them out on the floor, if you will. I don't think I have a floor big enough for a king size quilt. So got some questions here. Hi Vicki, I'm glad you made it back. Why use interfacing? Isn't the glue working well? Well, with the reason for the interfacing, and now I don't have one to show you, but that seam is just butt together. It's not, the glue is not holding the batting layers together that are right there. The glue is only holding the cream color edge over. So if you look at this, you can see where those are butt together. The glue only held it here. What the interfacing is doing is making it so that as this quilt gets used and washed, that open seam, those two butt edges, don't just kind of, end up playing around inside. That sounded awful, but just hanging out inside that seam. They're instead, because of that interfacing will stay. It's not like that interfacing is a wash out type thing. It's going to stay there, and it is going to keep this sashing seam through washings to stay really, really nice. I hope that's what you were wondering. So the glue is just to hold over the edge of the cream while I'm sewing it. It's the batting tape, the interfacing is to hold the seams together. And somebody mentioned up there too, yeah, if you take any tricot fusible interfacing, which is why I mentioned to you, that's what it is. It's tricot fusible interfacing, which is French fuse, but it's tricot by the style that it is. If you want to cut it into strips, it's definitely cheaper than buying it on the roll. But that's when you start thinking about, how much is my time worth? My time? I don't really have that much time for that. So I just buy it like this. And like the Mary Ellen's Best Press, when it first came out, I thought that's just ridiculous. Why would I need that? And then you use it and you put a couple of battings together with it that way. And you're like, okay, yep, I need that. And I use it all the time. Like I said, I buy it in the 100-yard. It's a big roll like this. The shop special orders it for me. Works out great. Am I completing each row, then attaching each completed? Nope, Ange, I'm not. So what I did and what I do in the instructions is I first put the center together. And this is just the idea. Yes, you could do it as one big row. I just kind of like building it out as I go. So I did the 4 together. Then I did just these 2 blocks together and attached them to the center square. Then I did these 2 blocks together and attached them to the center square. Then this was one row, and then the bottom would be a row. And I would, if I were going to make it one more row bigger, I'd do the same thing. I would just put like the sides on and then the borders on. Could be done all in rows if you wanted to. That would be up to you. Well, you're very, very welcome. I'm glad I was able to answer your question. All right, any other questions? I'm going to have some sort of countdown here for any additional questions. So the memberships are out there. I really appreciate my members. I can see who you are on here. It's got the little tab tells me that you're a member. The memberships, the beginning quilter, that is a membership of only $4.99, $5. And for that one, that means that you can send me emails with questions and things like that, and I will try to do your questions on live like we're doing here. The second level is the designer level, and that one's only $9.99, and that is for learning how to do the electric quilt. So we've met a couple times already. It's been pretty fun. We've gotten to know each other, and we do that on Zoom. So that is not a live YouTube video. That is a private Zoom session with just with just designer and Quilt Addict members. They're able to join that. And we've been learning quite a bit about learning using EQ. It's been a lot of fun seeing everybody do different things. And then we've got a private Facebook page where they've been posting what they've been designing. And then the third level is the Quilt Addict. The Quilt Addict level is $19, $19.99. And with that one, you get to ask questions, you get to be part of the EQ training, and you get all of the E patterns. So it always starts out where I send you the E pattern for learning to quilt, and then, other quilts once a month. Although I did have somebody say, Nancy, I want to be a quilt addict, but I already have the learning to quilt, and I already have the tranquil stars, and I already have, and I'm like, well, that's all right. I just won't send you those. And so I just skip forward. So she's getting other ones. And then anytime I get a new pattern like this one, so this pattern will be on the website, but Quilt Addict members, they'll be able to get it. It'll be in their mailbox tomorrow. So they'll have the pattern for making the quilt. All right. So if there isn't any other questions, please give me a thumbs up. We sure do have a lot of people watching today, which is really cool. Sorry about all the technical difficulties. Yeah, it just is. It's going to happen. I hope that you accept them. I think that you guys do, and I really appreciate that. Give us a thumbs up. Add some comments. I do love your comments. And if you have any questions about the video, you can email me at quiltingwithnancy@gmail.com. So I will see you all later. I'm looking at a few last comments, and I think I'm just ready to say goodnight. So good night, Jim. I'm checking out many videos before starting my Quilt As You Go. That is a very, very good idea. So good night, Jim and Jackie and Vicky. And your last name is Noor, but I'm not sure how to say your first name. And all of you guys, and Sharon and everybody else. So have a great evening and have a wonderful weekend, and stay warm for those of you that are dealing with the snow.